Hello, welcome to the second Society of Authors at Home Festival, which runs until the 10th of December. So we're coming up for our last week now. So next Thursday is the end of it. So keep checking in to all the different events. I'm Jo McCrum. I administrate the Welsh group and also the Children's Writers and Illustrators group. And just to let you know that all our events are free. Well, most events are free. But if you can afford to, please consider donating to our Authors Contingency Fund. The link's in the chat bar, which supports authors in financial difficulty due to the health crisis. And don't forget, especially if you're Christmas shopping, that a percentage of sales from our virtual Blackwell store also goes towards the fund. The link to that is also in the chat bar, but actually we'd like you to go to the high street as well and buy from your local bookshop too. So housekeeping, you might have a few connection problems today. If you do, there's a refresh button at the top of your screen. Hit that or log out and come back in. We are recording today, so don't worry if it all goes wrong, you can catch up with the archive. We'll be taking questions on writing and creativity from the chat bar, so don't hold back. I've been told by Debbie that nothing is off limits, so you can pop them all inside and I'll ask them. We're running till 3:15, but we could probably go on for about 10 minutes, depending on how we go. So about our guest, Debbie. Deborah Moggach OBE has written 18 novels, many of which she's adapted for TV and film. The novels include Tulip Fever, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, which you might have known as These Foolish Things, and those were both made into movies, Heartbreak Hotel, and her latest title, The Carer. Her screenplay for Pride and Prejudice was nominated for a BAFTA, and she served as chair of the Society of Authors Management Committee. She's on our council, she's on the executive committee and the Council of the Royal Society of Literature. Debbie, I don't know how you find time to write. Anyway, thank you for welcoming us and letting us interrupt your working day. And it's good to see you in your space. And we're going to have a quick look around behind you because I know everyone's peering there in your den and there's lots of lovely things to see, I think. And then we're going to have a reading from The Carer and then we're going to take questions. So
Lovely. Well, welcome to you all. Leslie and Sally and Victoria and Jane and Catherine, many more. Anyway, it's very nice to be here. I'm speaking from the seaside in Kent. I'm speaking from my cottage in Kent, my holiday cottage, which I've gone to ground in because it's just so lovely here. And it's just lovely being in the country. I think it's been a huge solace for all of us to be able to go out into the countryside if we possibly can, or into parks. We've never needed nature more, even though it's the most filthy day here. I can see it's not everywhere. And there's Catherine in northern Spain. She'll be all right.
That's true. When I first spoke to you, Debbie, you'd been for a swim in the sea, and I was quite jealous. And I had this kind of vision of you having this kind of working routine where you jumped to the sea in the morning, was all sort of ready to go, and then got to your laptop and started sort of working away. I mean, do you say this is your holiday cottage? Do you always come here to work, or do you just work wherever you are? You just happen to be in Kent?
I just work wherever I am. I don't really have I do have a study in London, but I hardly use it. I just really work where I can find a table and not a lot of noise. I can't work, with music playing or with. I can work with people around, but I can't work with people quarrelling or any tensions around. I can't. But luckily, I'm all by myself, so there's nothing. No worries at all. And you can see it's a seaside because I've got some shells and things like that there. So I have been swimming in the sea up until last week, and I've wussied out now because it's just got too cold. But it's very good for clearing one's mind. And anyone who does wild sea swimming, they talk about it all the time. I bore people rigid about it because I sort of brag about it and bring it into the conversation all the time because I'm so proud of doing it. I've never done it this late before. Anyway, I've stopped, so we can stop talking about that. But I think clearing our head for all of us lot who are all writers is quite difficult at the moment because although a lot of us have practically nothing to do in a way, and although COVID time has not been that different for writers in that we're quite solitary people anyway, I feel that the national situation and the sort of great sense of doom and cosmic sadness is quite difficult to work in. But I think that's the least of our problems, really. So, do
you feel like it's like an argument in the background that with the kind of terrible news that you hear? Oh, certainly a lot of authors have commented that they find it hard to write during this time. I mean, do you have any kind of tips?
Well, I find it almost impossible because I spend the whole time logging on to The Guardian online and shivering with horror, and scaring myself and being unhappy for people, and also feeling quite useless, because I think a lot of creative people, feeling useless can be sort of hovering on the edge of one's vision all the time, because I often feel, I write books, but what good does that do when I could be, making people better, being a nurse or something. But it's plugged into lots of feelings. I think of lack of direction and all sorts of things. There was a very good, I was talking to Jo about this just before we came on air. There's a very good Thinking Aloud on Radio 4 yesterday about memory and COVID, and how, because a lot of us are alone, we no longer, or we're not seeing that many people, we no longer have other people to cement our observations and memories and narratives. And that means that they sort of disappear without being pinned down. And a lot of us are finding that actually our memory is not that good at the moment, which of course memory is very important for writing. It'll come back. It'll all come back. It'll all, 2 months, it'll be a sea change. But just now, I think it's not that great.
So you were going to begin with a reading with the carer. Do you want to do that? Because there were quite a few. I did actually read it over the weekend, and I thought there was lots there about writing and writers and today's situation, and what you also just said about creatives feeling sort of useless. What are they doing? What can they do more? And your characters do, by the end of the book, do more in the community. I kind of noticed sort of Phoebe and Robert sort of game. Anyway, if you read the first.
Yes. Well, Jo, it's very interesting you say that, because one of the themes of the book, as it is called The Carer, and it turns out to be staggeringly topical. It came out a year or so ago. The paperback came out this year. It's sort of the subtext is the distinction between people who, it's a class thing as much as anything else, who are sort of dicking about doing their books or doing their paintings or whatever, and the people who seem to be actually the backbone of society, who are often
Yes, the Mandys of this world.
The Mandys of this world.
Yes, who get on and help.
Yes, exactly. Badly paid and doing all the dirty jobs. And, one's thinking of people like, delivery drivers and people like that. But this is concentrating on carers. The book came about because some years ago, my mother, who's now died, she got dementia. And we engaged round-the-clock carers for her so she didn't have to go to a home. And my relationship with them, I found absolutely fascinating, because it was a very thick stew, this relationship, of huge gratitude, because they were looking after her and doing things that I couldn't do myself, even though I was perfectly capable, and in fact lived opposite her in London at the time. Guilt that I wasn't doing it myself, gratitude that they were doing it, resentment, which was an unlikely emotion in the mix, but resentment because she seemed to have really better time with them than she did with me. She'd tell them all sorts of things she'd never told me and open up to them and things like that, but also resentment because they sort of started dressing her differently, and they were watching daytime TV and doing scratch cards and things, and actually she loved all that, but I'd been too sort of snotty to do that sort of thing with her. And also laughs. We had a great time. I adored them, all three of them. But they'd come into the centre of my life, centre of my home. They knew everything about me. I knew everything about them, because we were all women together. And one of them, I've put one or two details in the book, but one of them was having an affair with a baggage handler in Luton Airport, and she used to read out his very saucy texts over my mother's sort of prone body. And one of the things I think about novels, my novels, can be funny, but they aren't exactly comic novels. But what this tragic situation had in it was plenty of humour, because humour is in every situation. I adapted Anne Frank's diary for the television, and even then, in that doomed situation, often it was very funny in that annex with those families squashed together. And I remember my mother once said, for instance, I think I put that in the book as well. She said, Debbie, there were 2 men in my bedroom last night. There was one under the bed and the other in the wardrobe. I've never believed in threesomes, and I'm not going to start now. I mean, I think that all life has humour in it, or irony, or black humour, or whatever it is, and that a lot of writers that I teach mistake solemnity for seriousness. And a serious novel can be funny. You only have to, read John Updike. Okay, so this is Mandy, as Jo was saying. Mandy is the name of the carer, who has a noddy dog in her car and a pair of marigold gloves. And the old boy who's being cared for is a widower called James. And he has 2 children in their 60s called Phoebe and Robert. Phoebe is having a hopeless love affair with a wizened old hippie in a hut in the wood in Wales and trying to do her rather hopeless paintings. Robert, her brother, is trying to write a Radnisher trilogy, all in old dialect that nobody's ever going to read. In other words, they're both what I would call dicking about a bit, doing that. So this is the arrival of Mandy. I think that's all we need to know. Okay, this is Phoebe, the daughter's point of view. The first thing she noticed was her skin. So smooth for somebody of 50. Eerily smooth, but then Mandy had never had children. Never been married as far as Phoebe knew. None of the normal wear and tear that makes a woman look used. Mandy was not beautiful, far from it. An overweight woman with Rosemary West specs, wearing a bobble hat and stripy tights. Something vaguely blokey about her. Sometime later, she told Phoebe, I tried to be a lesbian once, but it just didn't gel. Give me a man any day. I like the smell of their armpits. Phoebe liked her. Truly she did. Mandy had come to the rescue after her father had had his fall. 2 carers had come and gone. Rejoice from Zimbabwe, who talked all through his beloved Radio 4 and fed him some sort of maize meal that clogged up his bowels. Then there was Teresa from County Donegal, who was having a love affair with a baggage handler from Luton Airport, we know about that, and who sat texting him in a fug of cigarette smoke and reading out the replies while the kettle boiled dry and Dad dehydrated. So Mandy came to the rescue. Mandy from Solihull, arriving in her trusty Fiat Panda and bearing homemade shortbread because her speciality, flapjacks, played havoc with an old boy's dentures. Phoebe, normally wary, was encouraged by this early sign of empathy. Mandy hummed show tunes as the kettle boiled. Blood Brothers was her favourite, about 2 boys separated at birth. She said she'd seen it 3 times and blubbed like a baby. Phoebe understood why later. At the time, she was simply grateful that this bulky, chatty woman had entered their lives and restored her sanity. Her father's too, for within days, Mandy had become essential. So Mandy becomes very essential, and not only do they notice their father changing and seeming to have a new lease of life in some ways, because he's enjoying her company, but he's also going downhill, and Mandy seems to be ferreting about in the house quite a lot and rifling through paperwork, and they start to think that she might be up to something. And so that's when the plot thickens. I won't tell you anymore.
Yeah, I must admit, I did not see the twist coming, Debbie. I'm normally an expert twist observer, and there were a couple, one of which, if I mention Croydon, I'm not going to mention too much, did make me absolute cackle out loud. And my husband did say, well, he was a bit jealous actually, as a fellow writer, to have somebody actually laugh out loud with a book. He kind of. So anyway, but I noticed there's a quote on your website, I think it was, saying, I like setting up a seemingly or it's an interview, I think. I like setting up a seemingly happy family and then planting a stick of dynamite in the corner of the room, lighting the touch paper and watching what happens. And I kind of felt reading that obviously characters really sort of do come first with you, and I do feel that they're very believable, and although there's issues within your books, they're not sort of issue led. They come out quite naturally from the characterization. But that also sounds very unpredictable too. I mean, do you know when you sit down to write? Where do you start off? Is it with one particular character, or was it the situation here of your mother and the carers, or is it a great big mishmash of everything?
It's so, I mean, authors apparently hate the question, where do you get your ideas from? I like it. I think it's terribly interesting.
I noticed Mandy asked that of Robert.
Yes, I know. Because each book has a different genesis. One of them, Tulip Fever, that Jo mentioned, that came because I bought an old master painting and a sort of Vermeer, very sub Vermeer, needless to say, and it inspired the whole book. And another one might happen because I see somebody stepping out of a coach with a pushchair and it's raining or something. And other ones, like Best Exotic, that just came from a general, almost a sociological thought of what's going to happen to us when we get older and who's going to look after us, because we haven't got the money to look after our old people. And why not outsource them to India, nice and warm and cheap, and everyone calls you auntie and is nice to you, and it's more interesting in the streets there than mouldering away, gazing at a ploughed field outside Bognor Regis in the rain. So that was a sort of a big general idea. And the stick of dynamite thing, image is that you were talking about, is that I would then make up, I then made up 6 or 7 old age pensioners and sent them to India to see what would happen to them and whether India would work its magic on them or would discomfort them or destroy them or inspire them to have another lease of life. And it was lovely to see what happened to them, although I usually do know the end. I do know where the destination is because I have to know the end. Some writers don't, and I'm sure many people who've done these talks rather like to push their little boat out into the rocky seas, storm, and see what happens. Just see how they cope. I would like to know the destination because that then informs the novel from the very first sentence in some subtle way. It's there.
Yes, like there's a hint, I suppose, in that. Yeah, which I hadn't got on the first reading, but exactly. With you there's you kind of know there's something. There's a bit of suspense there, isn't there?
I think that if your hero or heroine, if your heroine is going to go to Greenland at the end, or slit somebody's throat, or become a lesbian or something, that will be somehow within the very first page of the book. I find, but the wonderful thing about writing is that there are no rules, and I would suggest anyone who's interested, which you all are, else you wouldn't be here, even there's nothing else to do really, to read the Paris Review interviews, which you can probably get online now, because they were long form interviews with lots and lots of writers, and it illustrates how there is no template of how to write novels, and some people have to have certain sort of pen and only work when they're very drunk, and other people have office hours. I mean, every single difference in the world, and some people know the plot and some people prefer to not to at all.
Do you ever feel like sort of revisiting your characters? I've kind of noticed that Buffy is turning up more frequently. I think he started off in the Exwives, and then Heartbreak Hotel, and now The Carer. And I kind of thought, with all your standalones, and then there's a lot of genres there as well, sort of historical novels, thrillers. Would you ever consider writing a series, perhaps writing one book around Buffy, or do you feel very much like each book is kind of, you've done your project and now you're moving on?
Well, it's very interesting, that question, because one novel came about because I wrote a short story, in fact, about a coach driver, funnily enough, and he sort of hung around when I'd finished the short story, rather like a guest. You come down in the morning and after a party, and the guest is still there, hanging around in the kitchen waiting for a cup of tea. And certain characters, they just won't go away. And Buffy, the one that Jo's just mentioning, he's a boozy old actor, beardy old chap, flamboyant dresser, who's had many ex-wives, because he was the hero of a novel called The Ex-Wives. And he was slightly based on sort of Augustus John, apparently, used to pat the heads of passing children in Soho just in case one of them was his. And Buffy's motto was, I don't think I'll get married again. I'll just find a woman I don't like and give her a house. It's one of my favourite quotes, being twice married myself. And he was the hero of this novel, The Exwives, and I had fantastic fun with it because some of my novels, when we're thinking about humour, talking about humour, I just longed for a novel that made me laugh all the way through. And so I wrote this one called The Exwives, and then he didn't go away, and he lived in a block of flats in my imagination, a real block of flats off the Edgware Road in London, and in Maida Vale. And it was a sort of block of flats that discarded husbands go and live in when they've been chucked out by their wives. Rather sort of dingy, sort of a very temporary place. And I'd go past in the bus or in the car, and I'd almost see him behind the net curtains, sort of standing there waiting for me to give him another life and another story. So I wrote a novel called Heartbreak Hotel, which was set in Wales. I was then living in Prestine on the Welsh border. And because I just couldn't get rid of him, and I adored him. And he was very close to my heart because he was a man who realised that women love conversations. They love a chatty man, actually. Lots and lots of women do. I've never been one for the strong, silent type myself. So he came back again and again.
Oh, so we might see him again, perhaps.
I think he's retired. I think he's
retired.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So I have a question about another quote from you. I began writing screenplays in the mid-'80s and like moving back and forth between the interior world of the novel and the conflict-driven life of drama. And I found that really interesting because I kind of thought there's very few people that oscillate between the two. And I kind of thought, how do you make this work? Do you kind of work on films and novels at the same time, or do you alternate years? How did you get into TV? What skills and techniques inform one to the other? Do they cross-fertilize? Those were all my thoughts about I wanted to ask you. I told you, if no one asked questions, I got loads.
Well, temperamentally, I'm not suited to being a novelist in a way because I'm quite a social creature. I mean, I wish you were all here in the room and we could have a proper talk. I like being amongst people. And novel writing, as we all know, is very solitary. But it's also very, very free because that world you're entering into as you write is your private world and you can make anything happen. Or if your characters have enough life, they will cause things to happen. And when it's going well, it is just more fun than fun. It's so thrilling. And those of you who write full-length novels will know the feeling when it does. Sometimes it's awful, of course. But screenwriting, so I miss that when I'm writing novels. I miss the camaraderie. And screenwriting is completely different. In a way, you're only using 2 pistons in your brain rather than 4, because what you write is it may not be communal yet, but it has eyes on it in your head, all the other people who are involved in it, the script editor, the producer, the director, the actors, even the editor who'll come along and cut it away. So you're writing, you're not writing by committee, but you're writing a blueprint that other people will take over. And you have to be very resilient and adaptable. If you're writing a novel, you can say, look, I don't want to change this and everything. When you're writing a screenplay, you have to be adaptable. And it's all to do with redrafting as well. So it's a very different process. And I think why I can sort of do it, or anyway, have done lots in the past, is because I've got a very visual brain. I can visualize the room in which a character is sitting, which lots of novelists don't. And it's a very interesting question to ask yourselves, or indeed other people who write, how much of the surroundings do you see, or how much of your characters can you visualize what's going on in the scenes you're writing? Because quite a lot of novelists don't, and it often doesn't show in the writing. But it's an interesting thing. But I always see that because because I've always sort of drawn, and I'm quite a visual person, and I also am quite narratively driven, plot-wise. I like plots, and screenplays, it's all to do with pushing the story along. And I would say that screenplays are verbs and novels are nouns. And the noun of a novel can mean that you can live in that interior life of the character with their dreams and their fantasies and their childhood, and hardly anything need happen. I mean, if any of you have read Nicholson Baker's The Mezzanine, one of my favourite novels, that's set in New York, and it's a man who in his lunch hour goes to buy a pair of shoelaces. Have you read it, Jo?
I haven't. I will write it down. And
it's really good. It's called The Mezzanine, Nicholson Baker, and absolutely nothing happens. He doesn't even buy his shoelaces, as far as I remember. But it's all what goes on in his head in that lunch hour. And that's a novel. You know, you don't have to have a huge plot. There are so few plots in the world anyway. So I think that exterior world of screenplay writing and the interior world of novels, if you get tired of screenplay writing and these script meetings about a script that's never going to get done because the BBC can't afford it or somebody changes their jobs or something, what a relief to go to the private world of writing a novel where you're the master of it and nobody's going to boss you about, and vice versa. So I'm terribly lucky. I mean, I haven't had anything put on for ages as far as screenplays go, and I've got a bit fed up with everything being rejected. So, but I've had a good run for my money.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I think there's the whole, I mean, people do say about development hell, and I think, was Tulip Fever something like 15 years, or am I exaggerating? I'm exaggerating, probably. 20! Oh my goodness. Probably some actresses grew up and retired.
I know. I think, God, I've forgotten who was going to be in it originally. This is a book that I wrote that was optioned by Spielberg, and it fell by the wayside because of financial things and tax.
It was Black Tuesday, wasn't it? Some sort of changes to the tax.
Yes, and it was just about to be made. It was going to be the big British film of the year, $48 million film, and that was just about to be done when it was scuppered. And then a new producer, not Spielberg, rose to the rescue, which happened to be called Harvey Weinstein. So it was out of the frying pan into the fire, because he then did develop it and it was made into a film. I was an extra. I love being an extra in my films. But just when the film was going to be released, the whole sex scandal blew up and his company overnight disintegrated. So that film was a complete disaster, actually. It was a lovely film. It was really good. Everyone was in it, from Judi Dench to Cara Delevingne to Alicia Vikander. It was a very beautiful film, actually, but it never got to the cinemas, really. You can get it on DVD, I think.
Oh, do you feel sort of in your heart that the something like, when you're working on the sort of original sort of screenplays or adapting somebody else's work, you have a different relationship to your novel? I mean, how do you feel, or do you just feel they're just such different beasts? You don't really mind the novel of Tulip Fever set against the film. I mean, how creatively involved were you with that, or did you just sort of hand it over? And
no, well, Tulip Fever had a very rocky history as far as screenplay writers went. Everybody had a hand in writing. In the end, it was me and Tom Stoppard at different times, but we had the joint credit. And with Best Exotic, which was my other big film, that I wrote it, and then somebody else came along and wrote it again, and that was the one they used, really. And it was very different to the book, because the book of Best Exotic, which was called These Foolish Things when it came out, that it's much more complex, and it's subtler, much subtler, and darker, really. But I didn't like somebody else adapting my work, because I thought I could do it, really, because I'm quite detached from it. Once I finished it, I can move away and look at it as a screenwriter with my screenwriter hat on. And also, I don't want to be seen to be difficult or possessive of my original work or anything. So I bend over backwards, actually, to change everything quite often. Quite often the producers say, I quite like that bit in the book. But So I was quite upset when it was done. But then when I saw what those actors did with it, and when you've actors of the caliber of Maggie Smith and Judi Dench and Bill Nye and this staggering cast we had, because I think, you know, the thought of going to shoot a film in India in November with all your mates in a lovely hotel in India was rather irresistible. When I saw the caliber of them and I saw what a big heart the film had and what huge joy it gave people, actually, because it was tackling, and the book did this too, it was tackling getting older, not as incipient death and dementia and strokes and everything, although, you know, the wings of mortality was brushing its cheek. But it treated old people as just human beings with the same loves and resentments and jealousies and joys as everyone else. They're not old people. They're just people who happen to be a bit older. Like, you know, I'm 72. I feel 34. Everyone feels 34. So I think that helped with the film and with the book. It sort of triggered, it triggered quite a new way of looking at old age, actually, to sound a bit grand about it. And also, because we live so much longer, despite COVID and all these horrible things, it showed that, you know, it's not all over when you're 60, 70. You know, you can have a whole other life if you're up for it. You know, I got married again in my 60s. You know, people having love affairs and going around Nepal on elephants and things in the 80s. We're very, very different creatures.
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? That you know, society often does this sort of great big sort of teenager kind of narrative, and young people and then we're pushed to the side a little bit. And I do think, yes, Best Exotic has helped change those kind of perceptions with a certain younger audience, perhaps. Although Victoria in the chat says she agrees that she felt a lot of depth in the book, was a lot of it. But I suppose that's necessary, really, within a particular time frame.
Well, it's interesting, yes, Victoria. It's what you've touched on with that question. I'm just looking at or comment is that what one hopes. I sort of agree, but and I'm glad you say that, obviously, because that's really nice. But the actors, if they're of the caliber that we got, the actors bring that depth, and they will bring that interior world of the novel and of all those thoughts and dreams and all that, the past and everything. They've got it in their faces, and that's what they're paid for. A good film actor is a reactor. You see the weather of their face changing, and that tells you a huge amount. I mean, I'll give you an example from Pride and Prejudice, when I wrote the screenplay for that. In the book, of course, we know Elizabeth Bennet hugely, hugely well. And Keira Knightley has to carry that inner life with her in the film, and we have to see it through her eyes. Towards the end of the book and at the end of the film, Elizabeth Bennet bumps into Darcy at Pemberley, and they're both very discombobulated by this because they didn't expect to see each other. And they have the most boring exchange. She says, he says, fancy seeing you here. And she said, well, I'm on holiday with my uncle and aunt in Derbyshire. And he says, well, are you having a pleasant trip? And she says, yes, we went to Matlock. Yes. I mean, I can hardly bear to tell you it. It's so boring. Because they're English and they don't say what they think. But their faces are telling you, I just can't bear it. My pride made me completely misjudge you. We could have been happy here. We could love each other. I love you so much I can hardly breathe. I feel totally humiliated. That's what a good film. I mean, whatever you think of the performances in the film, I thought they were rather good. They're telling you that interior world that Jane Austen has given you in the novel, and it's a joy to see when it's done well. Really a joy. I mean, I've done things that have had terrible actors in them, but that was a pleasure.
Victoria agrees with you. She totally agrees. And Miriam asked whether The Carer, she thinks it would make a great TV drama, and I wanted to know whether you're adapting it. Well, has it been optioned? What's going on?
It has been optioned. Yeah. And as Jo is saying, it does have two huge plot twists, one much bigger than the other, that halfway through skews the whole story and reveals a whole lot of secrets and makes you view the past very differently. It's about family secrets and how we keep them covered up. But that makes it quite difficult to adapt because, in a way, that big gear changes things, and one of the characters disappears, and all sorts of things. But I am adapting it. But I've come to a shuddering halt for the reasons that I was talking about earlier. I just find it really difficult working and concentrating, and thinking there's a world out there that's going to want my pathetic little stuff, and whether it would actually be done anyway. Which hasn't been the case with a lot of my screenplays. And although it's a very hot topic and a very topical one, and it would make really good television, I just find it very difficult to get motivated. And I'll now just, dick around and go on websites and terrify myself and phone people up for a bit of company and things and go for a walk. And it's having all the time in the world. And long-term prisoners say this. I'm not saying that it's compatible in a way, but the time thing is, people who are in long stretches, they say that time both telescopes and becomes very, very fast, and it drags interminably, and they can't tell which way around that will be, whether it's going to drag in the afternoon or something. It just has a different rhythm, and days have a different rhythm, and to have a work ethic. Somebody like Jo who's working, you've got a proper job, but this horrible pandemic has rather shown up those of us who don't have what we call a proper job. I used to have a very strong work ethic. I worked every day, but it isn't really happening now. So I
think it's probably difficult as well because so little filming is going on.
Yes,
and insurance is so difficult. So if times were different, you'd probably have a deadline.
Yeah. Yes. Somebody would like to know, Socia, lovely name, Wand. I'd be interested to hear how Deborah deals with rejection. I was just picking up on that because we were talking about that. The way I deal with it is to remember that many, many wonderful writers have had, rejections from 30 publishers. I didn't think there were 30 publishers, but they could be rejected 30 publishers, and then 31st takes it on and it becomes famous novel. And I just pick myself up. I have a day or so of maundering about, filled with self-pity and bitterness and fury and all that stuff. And then I pick myself up and put it aside, literally put it away in a cupboard, and not literally, close the door on it and move on. Because unless one can learn from it, which one can sometimes, I've been rejected for things. Mostly, I haven't been rejected with novels so much, but a lot of my screenplays have been rejected, and I can see really why they haven't entirely worked, even though there are lots of reasons why screenplays are rejected, often not to do with the quality of the writing. But it's a thing of your character. You have to like with writing, you have to psych yourself up to be really confident. Terribly important this, that your characters are really interesting, that they've got something to say, that everyone will want to know what happens to Douglas and Marjorie and Annie and whoever. You've got to make them in your head interesting and make yourself confident that people will want to spend their precious time reading about them. And the same with rejection. You have to psych yourself up to slough it off and go on, unless the reasons for it make sense to you, in which case learn from it.
There's a related question from Miriam again. Yeah. Do you discuss an idea with your agent or publisher before you write, or do you write a complete manuscript and then submit? So I presume, Miriam, this is more about novels than film scripts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have freedom? Do you just go ahead and write? Do you have sort of continuing book deals, or is each kind of project new?
I absolutely hate talking about it before I begin. Because it's like letting the sunlight into a room and your, the watercolors fading, the characters all fade away. And also things seem so banal when one talks about them. You have to write it. So I've always written on spec, and the publishers don't know what I'm writing. But that's a bit of a luxury because you often need to fund it. So you need a bit of money up front to be able to have the time to write. So I've avoided that, partly because when I started, that was a very different landscape for writing, and you could do that. It was less of a risk in some way. So I don't tell people about it before, because I'm actually not at all a secretive person, but I'm quite secretive about my work. And if I saw somebody looking over my shoulder, I would. I mean, Hunter Davis once came to supper, and he went upstairs to the loo. And when he came down, this is in the days before computers. When he came downstairs, he said, "Oh, Debbie, I see you're writing about the Lake District. You ought to ask me about that." Looked, he'd gone into my study. And he said, "Typewriter? What was in my typewriter?" Cheek. So I don't. I prefer to let it develop, and also because it's going to change. If your characters have got life to them, they're going to change that story. And so what you've told people is not what people are going to get. It will never be what they get. Because the novel in your head is never the novel that you write. It'll always be different. And when you finish a novel, you're mourning not just saying goodbye to your characters, but you're mourning the novel that you would have, that you had in your head, that was always obviously better than the one that you wrote, and different. Because by the time you put the first word, the first sentence down, that novel is changing from what was in your head. That's a very long answer.
No, that's a good answer. I've got a question from Jane, who says, "I'm wondering which novelist you turn to read." We know that you read Nicholas Baker.
Nicholas Baker, yeah.
But
no, I tell you, it's for limbering up to what I would call sort of get your synapses going. I would read Beryl Bainbridge and John Updike, just a page or two. I mean, it's a very interesting question, this, because I think that there's certain writers who one reads who just sensitize you to words and make you realize what it's all about, whether you like their books or not. I actually like both of them. But at the moment, for instance, I'm reading Edith Wharton, who is peerlessly intelligent. And I'm reading her because I love her, but also because she stands back. She's very much in her characters' heads, but she also has an overview. And sometimes when you're writing, it's difficult to know what point of view you're going to have. Are you going to write it, for instance, in the first person, which can often liberate you? And you can write, say you're stuck in a book. I'm going off on a tangent for a moment, but say you're stuck when you're writing. It's very helpful, I've found, to turn it into the first person and to say, yes, you wouldn't believe what happened to me. I was just walking down the street or something. Suddenly it'll gallop ahead and you will start writing. It may not work in the novel as a whole because you may have different viewpoints or whatever. And there may be scenes where the person isn't in them and things, in which case just you can turn it back, but it can be liberating. Edith Wharton's wonderful because wonderful in every way, but because she stands back and she looks at the characters and she draws conclusions from what they're doing or draws overviews from what they're doing and then closes in again. And I also just love that period, turn of the century, last century, New York, which is a world that seems so lost now, but just heaven. So I'm reading her, and I'm reading Elizabeth Taylor, funnily enough.
You know what? I was just going to say, I bet you're a fan of Elizabeth Taylor.
I completely adore her.
I must admit that observation,
yes,
and dialogue really put me in mind of Elizabeth Taylor, actually.
Exactly, she's heaven, and I'd forgotten all about her until somebody was talking in the newspaper about the Soul of Kindness.
Right.
Philip Henshaw, somebody was. I think he's done the introduction, and I'm reading it now, and it's just peerlessly good. And both of them understand about humour within books, within scenes and everything. They're just
I think there's the one with the Augustus John character as well, with the artist. Is that Soul of Kindness?
Yes.
Where they're all living on a commune. And so Fran is saying, do you think it's true then that even with amazing previous success, each new work makes you doubt yourself?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
I think if you're worth your salt, and Michael Frayn and all the proper writers say that it doesn't get easier. I can occasionally coast along a bit, and I slightly, but I hope that I don't. I mean, one novel I wrote, which was an adaptation of a television drama I did, this is years and years ago, was sort of coasting along, but it should be more and more, not more and more difficult, but you should have challenges each time. I mean, I'm inclined, I was just suddenly thinking actually while we were talking about neatness and endings with novels, because I wrote a novel a long time ago called Seesaw, and I met, when it was just out in paperback, I met a friend and they said, "Oh, I like your book, Seesaw. Didn't quite understand the ending." And I said, "How does it end? I've forgotten." She told me. She said, "It ended in the children's playground." And I said, "Gosh, I didn't know it did that." So I got my author's copies that I'd only just got, and I looked at it, and the publishers had forgotten to print the last chapter. They missed it out. They completely missed it out, and improved the novel. Because it wasn't neatly tied up. It was rather a sort of suggestive ending in this children's playground.
I've heard of dumping the first chapter, but never the last.
I know. So, I mean, the publishers then pulped it, and they did it with the last chapter. But I learned a sort of lesson from that, which is, I'm prone to be a little bit neat because I rather like tying things up. But I think sometimes it's better not to.
A bit of ambiguity. How funny. Oh my goodness. So I have a last question maybe. Have we got time? We're at 3:19 now. So
can I just stop for a second? Because Ali Sherrick is saying, "I love Ethan Frome." I haven't read that. I'm going to read that. I was put off it because it sounded like a sort of rural, But anyway, I will. Thank you. Sorry, go on.
Well, we've probably got time for a couple, actually.
Yeah, go on.
Zosha, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Do you recycle an idea you love that was rejected and use it in a different form? So perhaps you might.
I don't think I have. I've managed to cobble it into the existing one, but I'm sure it's a good idea. I'm not saying it's a good or bad idea. I just haven't done it, but I would if I'd have to. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Juliet is asking, when did you first know you wanted to be a writer, and how long did it take to get to where you wanted to be as a writer? Now, I think your parents were writers.
They were both writers.
Did they ever persuade you to be a dentist or a lawyer or something sensible, or were they very encouraging?
They were quite encouraging, actually. They were both. My father wrote 120 books, of different sorts, everything from bubbles in comics to naval biographies and things. And my mother wrote and illustrated children's books, about 40 of them. So I was brought up in a writery family, though not a particularly intellectual one. My mother used to get Woman's Own and the Daily Mail and things. And they weren't hugely intellectual, but I was brought up to consider writing both completely the natural thing to do, sitting at a typewriter all day, and rather magical, because I had a piebald pony, for instance, that I loved, obviously. Who wouldn't love having a pony? And I'd find it in my mother's books, my pony called Wally. And so it was sort of in my background, but I didn't want to be like my parents, because who wants to be like your parents? I trained as a teacher. I was a hopeless teacher because I was too sucking up to the children, too anxious to be loved. Not a good thing in a teacher. I did lots of other things. Waitressing, I loved. I've always liked waitressing. But then I started writing properly when I went to live in Pakistan with Mr. Moggach, my first husband. And when I was 25 or 26, and I lived there for 2 years. And that was very, very liberating, to be deracinated and to be pulled out and put into a completely different place, because all your worries about what people are going to think about you writing, or how people are going to react to it, or everyone else is, or Waterstone's bookshops are full of books, all that stuff goes out the window. You're in a foreign place, and you can maybe make sense of your past or your past experience, which you'll use in your books, much easier when you're separated from them and can shape them up. You can shape up things when you're not in the thick of it. So I think for all of you who are writing, it's jolly useful to be able to move out of your normal place to work if you possibly can. I mean, even shed in the garden. I mean, I know several writers. I know one writer who lives in a glorious, huge house in Norfolk that he built himself, all centrally heated, all reclaimed beams everywhere and Argas and God knows what. And every day he solemnly traipses to his horrible garden shed, which is filled with dead wasps and paraffin heater fumes and a horrible old sofa-smelling dog. And he sits there solemnly writing his books because he feels so free. And he does have a point, although it is quite comic. And actually, I put that thing in the
Yes, Robert.
That's what Robert does, and he lives in a £6 million house in Wimbledon, and he does that.
But I think perhaps you need to go to the other, or you need to take yourself away from home life, I think, and any kind of, especially if you have children, and any kind of conflicts and arguments that go on there. But maybe during lockdown, that's also been a problem with people sharing their spaces and having to carve out writing life within busy households. And
it's so difficult with children not having laptops and not getting a signal and being left behind at school and feeling. I mean, it's been absolutely ghastly, but it will get better in a couple of months. I say April the 2nd because that's when the James Bond film is coming back.
That would be it. I have a final question from Susan, and she says, have you read the new Rachel Joyce?
No, is the answer. I read the first one, the Journey of Thingy-Jogs, Harold Fry.
Oh, that came from a radio play originally, which
was it?
co-won the Tenniswood with Mike Bartlett.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that. No, I loved it. I thought it was really very good. But I haven't read the next one.
Okay. And I don't think there's any more questions. Is there any final tips? What was the best tip? As a maybe final thing, what's the best tip you've ever been given or would like to hand on to?
I'd have a couple of tips. One would be find out when you're creative, what time of day you're creative. Like, it's often in the morning, and the afternoon one goes completely off the ball, and there's no point in trying to work. Just become a normal human being. Or it may be in the evening, or it may be whatever. Find out and then stick to your working hours. Don't go to lunch, don't do anything like that. The other thing, which is to do with screenwriting and adaptation, which would tell you more than anything that you learn from people or books. Get a DVD of a film that you love that has a good, say, Sense and Sensibility, which has a Emma Thompson screenplay of the Jane Austen novel, peerless screenplay. Watch the film, read the book, and download the screenplay and read it. And you can see what a good screenwriter does to a book. And you learn more about adaptation and how to be bold and sort of kill your darlings in a way, but in a loving way, if you can imagine that. Or L.P. Hartley, that had a wonderful Pinter script, or Shortcuts, that had a wonderful Robert Altman and Frank Barheit script from the Raymond Carver short stories. Do those three things. It's really interesting and fun. And you'll learn a lot about how to adapt the interior world of the novel to the exterior world.
I think if you go to the BBC Writers' Room, there's lots of scripts there for free as well, if people want to take a look. And
I've been reading the Sally Wainwright ones last night in Halifax because I've got a bit stuck on my carer script, and they thought I should read them. And it's fascinating. And also, you see some script writers have all sorts of extraneous stuff in that you wouldn't think you need, and it demystifies it, which is quite good, because even the layout sometimes puts people off, but it's dead easy, and most script writers don't seem to have a clue either, actually.
Oh, well, that's good to know, actually, isn't it? Isn't that sort of gratifying that you can sort of think, oh, do they really know what they're doing? Perhaps I'll be okay. I'll be fine. I'll just have a bash myself.
As William Goldman says, nobody knows anything. We just have to plough our own furrow and believe. What we have to do is to believe in ourselves and believe in what we're writing, even if we're shy and insecure and have no self-belief. We must believe in it when we're doing it, and then other people will. And that is a sort of one of the secrets.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful thing to hear, and thank you so much, Debbie. And it's a double thanks.
Thank you, and all these people.
Look at all the thanks at the side as well.
And you.
I have to say as well, Debbie donated her fee today for the author's contingency fund. So thank you for that. Don't forget, you can continue any conversation on Twitter with the festival hashtag SOA at home. And then tomorrow we have an end of year quiz with goodies. Goodies could be won tomorrow if you want to join in. And next week's sessions include seminars on online marketing, contracts, and an afternoon tea with Dean Atter. Don't forget, there are also Zoom socials with local groups going on all around the country, so you don't have to feel alone. You can just chat to people in Aberystwyth, Llandudno, Putney, not Brixton, I think, but Bristol. And do let us know if you want to start a group in your area, and we can facilitate that. So I'd like to do big rounds of applause.
Thank you so much. And maybe
thank you.
Somebody could recommend me a good hairdresser. That would be very useful.
Maybe. Oh yes. Okay. So you can send that on, and we'll send that on to Debbie. It looks fine, Debbie. I don't think you need to worry about it.
Thank you so much. Have the rest of the day. Good.
Thank you to everyone.
Good luck with your
giving up their afternoon. And I'm going to eject everybody now.
Bye.
Bye.